So the change that's happened now, all I can say is it's long in coming, overdue, and it's very gratifying to me to see this happen. And I really have this feeling that this could be the one thing out there that might turn it all around.
If somebody you care about comes to you and they're suffering from a mental health challenge, how do you go about directing them or helping them?
Well, if possible, I refer them to an integrative psychiatrist. There aren't that many of them around, but they're getting to be more and more. We're training them, but someone who doesn't simply rely on medication. And there are so many available approaches to mental health, everything from lifestyle advice, diet, supplements, exercise, cognitive therapy, spiritual techniques, psychological techniques. I mean, there's an endless array, and medication should be low on the list.
So to start off, though, let's get into some of this lifestyle diet stuff that people can apply right away if they're in that mild to moderate category suffering from a mental health challenge. Or again, severe. They want to apply this as well, but they probably want to get some help in that case as well.
Well, the commonest problems are depression and anxiety. That covers a lot of territory. And I think with depression, we have very good evidence that regular physical activity both prevents and treats depression. Also, that an anti-inflammatory diet that I recommend is very helpful. I think people should supplement with omega-3 fatty acids, make sure that their vitamin D levels are in the optimum range. I mean, that's simple stuff to start with. Then there's other obvious things to do that many people don't think of. If you're depressed, it's not good to listen all the time to sad music and read sad books and watch sad films and also hang out with people who are unhappy. We know that moods are contagious. In fact, you can even track the spread of moods through a population just as you can track infectious disease. And we know that if you live within a half mile of a happy person, your chances of being happy are increased by a certain percentage. And if that person moves farther away, the effect falls off. So that's something just to be aware of. That's obvious stuff.
Yeah, lots of good stuff there. But I want to get into some of the nuances. Let's take the diet piece, because this is something that there is so much controversy, even in the health and wellness space, over what diet is best. And again, in this context, we're talking from a well-being mental health standpoint. When you say a healthy diet, what does that encompass? Let's get into the micro here.
Okay, first of all, I would inquire about a person's use of alcohol and stimulants, like all forms of caffeine, for example, because that certainly affects mood. Then I think the main piece of advice that I give is to try to eliminate refined, processed, and manufactured foods. I mean, that's simple. It's that kind of food that's far removed from nature does not give us the things that we need. And often just reducing that and beginning to eat more natural foods is very helpful. With depression, we know that there is a link between inflammation in the body and depression. So that's where the anti-inflammatory diet, I think, is very useful. And that's not a hard one to follow. It's based on the Mediterranean diet. It does not remove pleasure from food, but it tells you which kinds of fats are good and which kinds of carbohydrates and so forth.
Well, we got into a lot of that was what to remove from the diet. We talked about caffeine, alcohol, and processed foods, a little bit into what we're going to consume with the Mediterranean template there. But let's get into from a specific standpoint of things we can include specifically for somebody who's dealing with a mental health challenge, adjuncts, whether it be certain foods or supplements that we can put into this diet that we've removed the processed foods and such.
Well, I mentioned omega-3 fatty acids. So the best sources of those are things like salmon and sardines. Sardines are cheap and they're everywhere. It's an easy thing to add. It is good to eat a variety of vegetables, especially fruits as well, across the color spectrum, because all these different colors of foods have unique protective elements in them, a lot of them protecting brain health as well. And we're finding out more and more about how micronutrient deficiencies really strongly affect brain function and emotional well-being. So good quality fish, good quality produce, the right fats, which is for me mostly olive oil, and the right kinds of carbohydrates, which are slow digesting ones like truly whole grains, starchy things like winter squash, sweet potatoes.
When it comes to mental health challenges, we have the DSM and we have an array of different quote unquote problems that people who are suffering can, these different ailments that they can have, and that we can come up with a diagnosis and treatment plan for. What medicine often likes to do is silo different parts of the body and different areas of specialization when it comes to, medical doctors and what they treat and what they work with. What are your thoughts on an upstream approach to mental health where, there obviously is different nuances to the way people suffer when it comes to mental health, but is there a more upstream approach for people that are suffering that we can look at? You talked about the diet. Like, is a lot of what we're going to talk about today cover the basis depending on whatever quote unquote diagnosis you have?
Separate the mind and the body. So whenever there's a disturbance in the body, there's a disturbance in the mind, and vice versa. I think one of the things that's really gone wrong is that psychiatry has become so separate from the rest of medicine. You can't separate these things. Also, with the commonest conditions, I talked some about depression, but anxiety is also a huge problem in our society. And the simplest approach to that is regulation of the breath. And as you know, I often recommend a simple breathing technique, the 4-7-8 breath. You can Google my name and find YouTube demonstrations of it. That's the most effective anti-anxiety measure I've ever discovered, and doesn't cost anything.
So yeah, we've talked about that breath before. It is a great tool. And for me, the way I understand that, that's kind of like something you do on a regular basis to get your baseline of breathing in good shape. But what about for specific instances? Is there different techniques that you'll use for different, like say you're going to go and do a public talk or something to get your mind zoned in properly? Or other instances, you could use different examples, but different techniques for different uses.
There's hundreds of different breathing techniques, but that 4-7-8 breath is the most applicable one. I use it before I give a public talk. It's the best centering technique I've ever found. It's so simple.
Let's come back to the mind-body connection. And right away when you say that, two things pop into my head, the two different ways that we can specifically connect the mind and body. One being the microbiome, and two being the vagus nerve. So let's take time and go into each of these and talk about how these are both direct and indirect. I would say the vagus nerve is more of a direct and the microbiome is more of an indirect connection between the mind and body.
Well, I think the discovery of the connections between those two systems and the brain and the mind, these are great discoveries of recent years, and so different from the information that was around when I was in medical school. When I was in medical school, I was taught almost nothing about the microbiome, just that we had bacteria in the colon that helped digest food. But now we're finding, every day there's new research showing how the organisms we have in our gut influence our interactions with the environment and have a very strong influence on our moods. That's fascinating. There's a lot of practical questions there about how we can change that and how we can improve the health of the microbiome. We know a lot of things we can do that damage it, like taking antibiotics and eating the wrong kinds of foods, but that's huge. And I think we're going to find out more and more about it. The vagus nerve is the largest nerve in the body. It's a main part of the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the relaxing nervous system. It controls the gut and motion in the gut. And when I was in medical school, I was taught that's what it did. There was not like back and forth transmission. And now we know that neurotransmitters made in the gut actually travel through the vagus to the brain. So looking at the action of the vagus and whether it's in good condition, not good condition, this is a whole new area of medicine, completely new.
One thing I want to get into there, and you started to talk about it, when we talk about different neurotransmitters in the gut, specifically serotonin, there's often people, I don't know who's the original person that came up with the quote, but like it's somewhere around 90% of the serotonin in our body is made in the gut. How does that get to the brain was going to be my question, but you started to talk about it there through the vagus nerve. So it looks like these two different systems that we talked about separately in the end came together. So the nerve can take the neurotransmitters from the gut up to the brain.
Hmm. And the gut has been called the second brain. And it is indeed that. And with gastrointestinal ailments, the mind body connection is so prominent. And you always want to work on that compartment, not just treat the physical body.
Let's get into the specifics of the gut microbiome. What can we do? You mentioned antibiotics there, and that being something that wreaks havoc on the gut microbiome. Let's say most of us have taken antibiotics somewhere in our lifetime, and they do have their role. But let's talk from a standpoint of somebody who's trying to rebuild the gut microbiome, and then from somebody who is at a more maintenance level and they want to just maintain that on a day-to-day basis for good gut health and for good brain health.
So a big question is whether it's worth taking probiotic supplements. I think that's an open question. I have to tell you, most of the microbiome researchers that I know are not that enthusiastic about probiotic supplements. On the other hand, they're very enthusiastic about fermented foods. So the main advice that I would give is that it is very useful to include fermented foods in the diet. And I think it's also good to learn how to make them yourself because they're easy to make, they're cheap, they're delicious. I make my own sauerkraut. I make pickles. I make kimchi. I sometimes make yogurt. I make some Japanese fermented stuff. I think having this around your kitchen and including these in the diet, very, very healthy thing to do.
And I think there's something, you mentioned making your own fermented veggies there. I think there's something to that, reforming a connection with our food, because a lot of us in the West, we go to the grocery store and this is just what we've always done. Pick up our meat that's already been, the animal's been killed, it's been cleaned, it's put under nice saran wrap, and our vegetables are all neatly placed with stickers on them that have codes that talk about where their origin is and if they're organic or not. But when we get in there with our hands and actually interact with our food, there's kind of like a spiritual connection with it. I'd love for you to talk about if you feel that when you're getting your hands dirty and making your own fermented veggies.
Absolutely. And these fermented things are alive and you can see that they're alive. I think many people don't understand the difference between dead pickles and living pickles. The pickles in the interior of the supermarket that are not refrigerated are made with vinegar. There's no living organisms in them. The ones that are refrigerated and that bubble and sometimes burst the jar, those are making they're organisms that make lactic acid, which has a different flavor from the acetic acid in vinegar. To me, much tastier. And those are the ones that are delivering probiotic organisms to you. But as I said, it's very easy to learn how to make these things yourself. There's lots of information on the internet, a lot of books about making your own fermented foods. And as I said, they're cheap, economical, and we're quite sure that having those regularly in the diet does very good things for gut health.
What are your thoughts on leaky gut? This is something that comes up a lot in the health and wellness space. There's a lot of people that are pro that word. There's a lot of people that are anti and don't believe it's actually a thing. What are your thoughts? What has your research shown?
But before I answer that, let me say one other thing about the microbiome. The other thing that we can do is make sure we're eating things that feed the organisms that we want. And those are foods called prebiotics. And in general, it's high fiber foods and various kinds of fiber from grains, from beans, and so forth. So that feeds the populations of organisms that you want. In terms of leaky gut, not that long ago, that was a term used mainly by alternative practitioners, and conventional medicine really poo-pooed the idea that things could leak out of the gut. I think that's really changed now. First of all, there's this information about how the vagus carries things out of the gut, but also if there is inflammation in the gut, there are things that cross the gut barrier that normally would not get into the blood or the general system that may cause problems at a distance, including problems in the brain and immune reactions. So I think that's a real phenomenon, and more people are coming to recognize that.
And if somebody is at that critical state where they actually have a leaky gut, is there a certain protocol or certain things that you can include in the diet to help heal that and seal that up?
Yes, I think one is a supplement called L-glutamine. It's an amino acid and completely harmless and can be taken long term. That's very helpful. Another one is the yellow spice turmeric, the most powerful natural anti-inflammatory agent, and works very well in the gut to control inflammation, which may cause leaky gut. So those are two things you can do.
Let's come back to the vagus nerve. Knowing what we know about it, the fact that it's a two-way communication between the brain and the rest of the body, what do we do with that in a practical sense?
Well, I think we're just beginning to learn things we can do. One is, that 478 breath that I described, that increases parasympathetic tone. So that's good for the health of the vagus. There's also methods of directly stimulating the vagus. So there are vagal stimulation techniques that are available. I don't think they're widely practiced yet, but they're becoming available. So that's something that can be checked and that you can experiment with.
I believe if you do humming in a deep way or gargling really deeply or even poking and activating that gag reflex in the back of your throat, those are all ways that you can train that nerve.
The other is straining against the closed glottis, like just when you hold your breath and squeeze. That also increases vagal tone.
Let's talk about other ways to train and get from a sympathetic state to a parasympathetic, because in today's world, we are so go, 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 always connected. And a lot of us just don't slow down and let our bodies get into that slower parasympathetic healing, rest, and digest state.
Yeah, that's been called the relaxation response. And it is absolutely true. I think most people in our society are in sympathetic overdrive. This is the fight or flight response, which is supposed to turn off when an emergency ends, but in a lot of people, it never turns off now. And learning to decrease sympathetic activity and increase parasympathetic activity, I think is one of the most important health things you can do. So one is to avoid things that you're eating or drinking that directly stimulate the sympathetic nervous system. And that's most stimulants. So I really look, I have to say, when I was actively practicing, I used to say that I would produce one miracle cure a week by getting people off coffee. Coffee is a strong drug, and there's a great range of sensitivity to it. I'm relatively resistant to the effects of caffeine, but there are people who drink one cup of coffee in the morning and have no idea that's why they can't sleep at night. And there are other people who drink a pot of coffee after dinner and it doesn't do anything to them. So you want to know where you are on that spectrum. But coffee is a strong drug for many people, and it's one of the things responsible for overactive sympathetic nervous system. Lots of other stimulants out there too, including many that are in over-the-counter medicines. Things like pseudoephedrine, for example, nasal decongestants. A lot of these things have stimulant effects, and they can add on to other stimulants that people are using, like cola and chocolate and yerba mate and even tea in large quantities. As you know, I'm a big fan of matcha green tea, which is somewhat different in that it contains a relaxing element called L-theanine. And that modifies the effect of caffeine and produces an alert state very different from the stimulation of coffee and other forms of caffeine.
And you mentioned a number of stimulants there. And I think where people can get in trouble as well is where they start layering those on. So they start the day with a coffee, maybe have a tea and then some chocolate after lunch. And over time, they're
Or
just
an energy
ramping up.
drink also. Yeah,
Exactly.
right.
Hopefully not,
Yeah.
but that could be
Yeah.
part of the picture as well.
Then there's, other things that activate that response are noise, which many people are unconscious about. Things like sirens, loud music, can up the sympathetic activity. Being around people who are anxious, as I said, moods are contagious. So I think you want to pay attention to influences that may be revving up your sympathetic nervous system and try to modify those.
And what about on the other end of the spectrum? You talked about loud noises that are going to interfere in a negative way. What about surrounding ourselves in nature? Or maybe this is good, maybe not. I'll be curious what you think, but those nature tracks that we can play that, simulate that we're out in nature while we're working or whatnot in the house. Talk about, yeah, from the other aspect,
Yeah,
things
I
that we
think
can
that's
do in a positive way to enhance using sound and noise.
I think listening to natural sounds and exposing yourself to natural sights is very helpful. And natural sounds like water falling, water over rocks, wind blowing through a forest. This has different sound quality from artificial sounds. That if you analyze the nature of the sound waves there, they're different, and I think they're very healthy for us. So that's a very good point. And of course, you can create those sounds in your own home very easily.
And one of the benefits, if you're actually getting outside and you're in an environment where you have good sunlight, you've talked about this before, where a lot of people probably believe that they're getting enough sun. But if you're at a latitude, is it Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia?
Atlanta, yes.
Yeah, if you're above that for a certain number of months of the year, I'll let you get into the
Half the
specifics.
year,
Half
right?
the year, you're not getting enough vitamin D from the sun.
Correct. And we know that vitamin D levels have a very strong influence on emotional well-being. So you want to get your vitamin D levels checked. I generally recommend that all people take supplemental vitamin D. I recommend 2,000 IU of vitamin D3 a day, but it's also good to get sun exposure, because when you get sun exposure, you're making more vitamin D receptors, which taking a supplement doesn't do. And sensible sun exposure, meaning you want to be aware of where the angle in the sky and protect yourself from too much ultraviolet.
And I'm a big fan of vitamin D supplements as well, and take them depending on the time of year. I'm up in Ontario, so I have a lot of the year where I'm not getting enough sunlight. But I'm always curious because in the big scheme of things, our knowledge versus what there is out there when it comes to sun exposure and what we might be getting from that. I'm just curious about, and obviously this is something that we're going to have to leave open because neither of us are going to have an answer, but I've got to believe there's certain aspects that we get from the sun that science isn't able to pinpoint just yet.
I agree with you. And, even in southern Arizona where I live, vitamin D deficiency is very common because dermatologists have made people so paranoid about the sun that everybody uses sunscreen, which blocks vitamin D synthesis. In countries like Saudi Arabia, very high incidence of vitamin D deficiency because people are indoors or all covered up. So it's a good idea to get vitamin D levels checked. And if they're very low, you may need some very high doses for a short period to get them back, and then you can stay on a regular maintenance dose.
And what are your thoughts about ranges when it comes to testing for vitamin D? Because we have the standard panel and it has a range there. What you recommend people getting into, when it comes to vitamin D, the range, is that above what conventional medicine recommends?
I recommend staying in the high optimum range. So that would be the upper end of normal range. I don't think there's any harm with being up there. And the benefits of vitamin D they're on so many different systems. And the connection with mental health is something we've seen only relatively recently.
When it comes to mental health, this might be a chicken or egg type of deal where when you think of stress, it could lead to different mental health challenges, and different mental health challenges could lead to a stressful situation. So I'm sure there's some kind of connection there. But let's go to the stress piece and talk about, as human beings in the 21st century, how big of a problem that is and things we can do to help tame that.
I think it's a huge problem. I don't think we can live without stress. That is the nature of life. I'll just tell you one story. I had a medical student some years ago who spent a lot of time in third world countries, and she really loved being in primitive areas and being the only doctor out there. And she worked as one of, I think, 6 doctors in a rural field hospital in northern Kenya, a very isolated area. And she went there with fantasies of treating elephantiasis and malaria and exotic diseases. Most of what she saw were psychosomatic diseases. It was back pain, headaches, and this is in a tribal society where you wouldn't think, they don't not exposed to all the things that stress us out, and there it was. So I think human life is stressful. So I don't think you can eliminate stress from your life, but what you can do, although obviously if there's obvious source of stress, like, a terrible boss, you should change your job. But what you can do, and what I recommend, is to learn and practice methods of neutralizing the harmful effects of stress on the mind and the body. And they're very significant. We know that stress directly is directly toxic to cells in the hippocampus in the brain, which is the area that mediates memory and emotion. It kills nerve cells. So, and that's mediated by the stress hormone cortisol. So you want to do something about that. Again, I recommend breath control as the simplest method, but there's all sorts of things. There's yoga, meditation, guided imagery, progressive relaxation, all sorts of things you can do. But you want to learn some method and practice it regularly.
And I think part of the solution is just feeling like you're not alone, where you talked about the tribes and how this was a problem for them as well. Realizing that having stress and ebbs and flows is part of the human condition and you're not alone, and having a realistic expectation for how you're going to feel day in, day out, and not stressing because you're stressed. I think that's part of the picture as well.
Yeah, a very good point. And, all that has become much more difficult during the pandemic because I think that's greatly increased social isolation and loneliness. But we know that social connection is highly protective of both physical health and mental health.
Well, let's get more into the nuances of that because this is a big piece. We can't talk about mental health without getting into connecting with others. We've evolved in tribes and in small groups, and this is part of what is very fulfilling and part of our well-being. So talk more about the nuances there.
Well, I have to say that I'm concerned about the rise of social media in our society and the extent to which so many people now interact virtually rather than really. I think that it does not provide the same benefits that true social interaction does. I think that one of the consistent findings in research on healthy aging is that people who maintain strong social and intellectual connection as they get older are healthier and are less prone to chronic disease. That's very clear research finding.
And it's interesting. Sometimes the things that are free and the easiest to do, I shouldn't say easy because it is a challenge, especially as an adult, to form new friendships and connections. But, relatively, if that's a goal of yours, like we can all go out and make the effort and connect with people and make new friendships. For some reason, though, it's just so much easier to just be like, Dr. Weil, tell me the latest superfood that I can, go on Amazon right after this and click an order and compliance to me seems so much higher. And I know I've been guilty of this as well for things that it's just something I can buy, something I can add into my smoothie versus these more subjective, nuanced things where you don't necessarily see the benefit right away connecting with other individuals.
I couldn't agree with you more there. And, just looking at my own life, I find now I rarely go to stores to shop anymore. I do most of my shopping online. So that's an area of social interaction that has sort of really disappeared from my life. And I have to make an effort to get out there and meet people. Most of my teaching in the past few years has been virtual on Zoom because of the pandemic. And that's been, I don't like that. I would like to go back to interacting in person with people.
Well, you come at this from a really unique place because you've been in this health and wellness space for so many years, pre-internet, pre-social media. Talk about that evolution a little bit from your perspective and seeing where things came from, the transformation in between and where we're at today, and how you've gone about handling that as best you can in a healthy way.
Well, it's just not the same. Having Zoom meetings is just not the same as having interactions in person. And what can I say? I enjoy in-person interactions. So I have to make an effort to make that happen in my life. By the way, let me say that when I was doing research on aging, I made a number of trips to Okinawa, which was at the time that I was doing that had the highest longevity in the world. And the very old people there were included in all community activities. They were considered valuable assets to society, and they were never allowed to be isolated. That's so different from what I see happen in this culture. And also, they interacted with people of all ages. They weren't just segregated into communities of old people.
And I can see benefits on both ends of that when you're including the elderly in the community. You're going to get a lot of wisdom from those people, a lot of teachings, and it's going to be good for the younger people, their
Everybody, yes.
well-being, and then the older as well, to be interacting and sharing that knowledge and feeling like, I think a big thing that they're going to get from that is feeling like they still have a sense of purpose as they age.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that, and that's another finding from aging research, that that feeling of connection and being valued is something that seems very protective of health and both physical and mental as you go through life.
Well, you're somebody again who's been in this space for a long time, and you've found your niche within it, and you've had longevity within your career, and I'm sure get that sense of satisfaction for continuing to pivot and experiment with new things, and you got into entrepreneurship with your restaurants, and you're somebody who continues to create and do new things. How have you been able to do that? I mean, you're getting on in age. Are you in your mid 70s?
I'm going to be 80 in about a week.
Yeah, so you're turning 80 soon, and you're still here doing this podcast and sharing a message and continue to be an active member in society and helping so many people. Talk about if that was a conscious thing for you, or if it just kind of was where your gut and lifestyle took you.
I would say I came into the world as a curious person, and it was not driven out of me. And I have to acknowledge my parents as being very helpful in encouraging my curiosity and my tendency to experiment. I think I worried them a lot of the time in some of the things they did, but they just felt that I should follow my passions and be curious. And I've never lost that. I'm anxious for new experience. If something comes along that interests me, I'm going to find out about it.
Well, part of what your curiosity took you into, and this was at a relatively early age, was psychedelics. And this can tie into the whole mental health conversation, especially today, where we're starting to see the legalization of these substances for treatment of different mental health issues, and people are openly talking about them again, and the box has been opened, and it doesn't seem to be going anywhere anytime soon. So again, this is something you've had you've had longevity in, and something you're still a proponent of. Let's talk about, in the case of mental health, how these substances hopefully are going to, crack open and shift the whole paradigm.
I think there's tremendous potential there. I first took mescaline in, 1961. So a very long time ago. And I think always saw the potential for these to have very beneficial effects on individual health, on societal health. It's taken a long time for this change to come about, but as you say, I think this is really going mainstream, and there's no way of putting the genie back in the bottle. A few months ago, Vogue magazine had a cover story on psilocybin. Town and Country magazine recently, of all things, Town and Country, had an article titled "Why is Everybody Smoking Toad Venom?" I mean, unbelievable. On TV series, people are microdosing. This is going mainstream. And also, I'll tell you that before the pandemic, when I was traveling a lot and speaking, no matter what topic I was talking about, whether it was healthy aging, integrative medicine, nutrition, the questions I got were about psychedelics. How can we find a guide? How can we get them? So the interest is tremendous. And I think the potential, well, I have to say this is a kind of little out there, but maybe this is the one thing that can turn our society around, because we are not in very good shape on a lot of fronts. And I think only a change in consciousness can really make things, move things in the right direction. And psychedelics have the potential to do that.
I could see this being a really challenging time for somebody who is learning of the potential of these different plant medicines. And because we're in that transition zone right now where things aren't fully legalized and it's still underground, it's like, how do you go about finding reliable sources to, find these quote unquote drugs and to do them in a healthy way and integrate it in a healthy way? So I could see how there would be a lot of frustration there for people that really need these sooner than later.
So I think a big need is for guides who can help people structure these experiences in a way that make them most profitable. So there are several institutions that are training people to do this. Our center at the University of Arizona is developing a curriculum in psychedelic therapy for the people that we train. So I think it's happening. But right now, it's very confused. The legal situation is not clear. We'll have to see how all this plays out. I don't know, but I think at root, it's a good thing.
Let's talk about your connection between traveling and psychedelics, because a big part of your story, and we've talked about this on previous shows, is how you've traveled around. You've done a lot of writing and work with different groups around the world. In your travels, in your work you've done, talk about some of the experiences you've had with psychedelics. And I'm curious, is this something that you see basically across the globe, or is it something that you're just seeing in these small isolated pockets? Because you have a really interesting perspective as somebody who is so well traveled.
Well, it's not across the globe, but it's over large parts of it, especially in the New World. The native peoples in North and South America were the most given to discovering and using psychedelic plants. In the Old World, in Africa, there are not very many of these things and not as much use. And there were other methods that were found to alter consciousness, like drumming and chanting and group dancing and so forth. But the use of psychedelic plants in native populations in the New World, very widespread. I visited a number of shamans who used mushrooms, who used ayahuasca, and watched what they did. Some of them worked as, I think, very skillful psychotherapists. They really knew how to structure a session in a way that produced a very positive outcome for people who came to them. So I saw some of the positive uses of these things, and it's just wonderful now that this is happening up here. I also think I'm a little disappointed that all the focus has been on emotional health. It's for depression and obsessive compulsive disorder and PTSD. I think there's a huge potential here in physical medicine as well. I think they have a tremendous possibility of helping people get out of chronic pain, of autoimmune conditions, of a whole range of things in which the mind-body connection is very important.
Talk more about that, because you are the only person I've heard emphasize this aspect. Is it the fact that it's altering consciousness and the way people think about the physical condition that they're experiencing? So does it, basically what I'm getting at, is it through the mind that it's impacting the body, or is it a direct response of the plant medicine on the body itself?
Maybe it's both, but I think that the effect on the mind is probably the more important. Even if you look at how opioids deal with pain, they don't block the perception of pain. If you talk to somebody who you haven't given them so much that their mind is fuzzy and ask them what they're experiencing, people often say, well, the pain is still there, but it doesn't bother me. Or it's as if it's happening to someone else. So clearly that's working on what's called the secondary perception of pain, not the primary reception of it. So I think that applies to a lot of things, that things are happening in the body, but there's latitude as to how they're interpreted in the mind. And that I think psychedelics can give you a glimpse of the possibility of perceiving what's going on in your body in a different way. And once you see that that's possible, then you can figure out ways of making that happen more of the time.
And what are your thoughts about using physical modalities, whether it be, you talked about chanting, I think, and drumming, which got me thinking about, say, something like dance, and using your physical body as a tool to impact the mind. So basically, yeah, unlocking different aspects of the mind by moving the physical body in certain patterns and rhythms through, say, dance.
I think that's been used throughout history in many different cultures, whether it's, it's dance, group dancing, chanting. I mean, many, many ways of doing this in different cultures. But I think lots of people have experimented that. And I think it's very real. I'll tell you one story. I was once at the Field Museum in Chicago, and I worked with the botanical staff there, and there was a night for donors to come where they put on, a show. And one of them, they had a huge gamelan ensemble, the percussion instruments used in Bali. I don't know how many different instruments, there were a lot. And they had a group that played gamelan. So all these people were standing around in the big hall. And one of the pieces that they played was a war chant that was supposed to ready people for battle. When this got going, I mean, I felt adrenaline surges in my body. I was ready to go out and break something. It was an amazing effect of sound on my mind body connection.
One interesting aspect of psychedelics is pulling back the veil and seeing more to the physical world than we are seeing day to day with our naked eye. And I know you're big into this, talking about being more to this life experience we're having than what we're seeing with our five senses. So I'd love for you to talk more about that and how that's been impacted through different psychedelic experiences you've had.
Over the years, many people who've used psychedelics have said that they've had these spiritual revelations and mystical experiences. They've come to view the world in a different way. And a lot of religious leaders have made fun of that, saying that these are artificial experiences. They're not, real spiritual experiences. I always felt really doesn't matter whether they're real or not. If they affect you and make you change your life, they're important. And now there is good research going on at Johns Hopkins University. A man named Roland Griffiths there is one of the main psychedelic researchers. And they have documented in their sessions these spiritual insights and the ways that people view themselves and the world after a psychedelic experience. This is part of why I say I think there is a potential of these things to turn consciousness around. One of the experiences that I've had on psychedelics is just a real sense that my consciousness is continuous with everything. That obviously my dogs are conscious, but I perceive plants to be conscious. I even perceive rocks and mountains to be conscious. There's some basic energy that's in me, that's in everything. And that way of seeing the world is very different from the way that conventional science would have to see it. And these experiments at Johns Hopkins are documenting that many people who take psychedelics come around to seeing things in this other way. If you see yourself as being connected to the environment in a very real way, then I think you're much more motivated to protect the environment. That's why I say I think the potential here is very great.
One thing I think of from time to time is how, as a human being, it would be so ignorant of us to assume that our five senses and the spectrum of those senses
Right.
is everything that there is. I mean,
obviously it isn't. I mean, we perceive such a narrow slice of reality.
That's what I'm getting at.
Bats hear a lot more than we do. Dogs smell a lot more than me. There's so much more out there.
Again, it would be ignorant for us to assume that just what we have is the maximum capacity and that we're taking in the full experience that's happening.
I couldn't agree more. And I think also that, when I look back on recent insights, when I was in school, when I was in college, the prevailing belief in science was that there were no other planets. That the solar system was unique, that there were no stars that had planets around them. That was the dogma, and suddenly they're everywhere, and what a change. And even the idea, it's only been since the 1920s that people realized that these fuzzy patches of light out there were other galaxies, that wasn't just all the Milky Way. So our view is constantly expanding, and I think it's got a lot of room to expand further.
One interesting aspect of this boom of psychedelics is the fact that a lot of them now are coming to North America, and we can do them in, cities and in these environments that aren't native to the plant medicine. So again, as somebody who's traveled, what are your thoughts on taking these medicines out of their natural environment, the natural ceremony and experience? How big of a piece is that? And can we bring them back into the big cities and still get the same benefits?
My guess is we can, but those are complicated questions, including one aspect of it is the whole idea of cultural appropriation. Are we taking things from indigenous societies and not compensating them for taking them? I mean, that's one question. What about people trying to patent these things, which exist in nature? I don't know the answer to that. My guess is that we can recreate the good aspects of these experiences in other settings. And there are ways of doing that here. Although, I wonder when a lot of the people doing psychedelic therapy, you're indoors lying on a couch with headphones, maybe it would be better to be doing this outdoors in a natural setting.
Can you share a specific story of when you were in a certain area where this plant medicine was located and you had a really authentic experience that included the environment, included a shaman, and how impactful that was on you going forward?
The first time that I took mushrooms, I was in southern Mexico, in Oaxaca, in one of these indigenous villages where the mushroom cults had originated, and I had met a shaman, a woman who gave a mushroom ceremony for me one night. At the time that I was there, this was in 1972, I think. The area had been sealed off because hippies had been coming in here, and the army sealed it off. Anyway, I got through, and so I was a lone gringo in this area where people didn't even speak Spanish. It was just the indigenous language. But there was a formal mushroom ceremony that started at night, and this was a night of a full moon. And these villages are on mountain peaks, connected at that time by very little narrow roads. And so I sat with this woman. She prayed with me. We talked. It was great. And then after a certain amount of time, she said, "You should go out and learn from the moon." So she went to bed. The family was in bed. I went out on the patio, and it was a very bright full moon. And I sat there for a while, and there was a total eclipse of the moon, which I did not know about. I didn't know it was going to happen. And watching this thing progress, to totality, I mean, it was blown away. And the next morning, I went in, and her mother was an elderly woman. I said there was an eclipse of the moon last night, and this woman went, that was a bad thing for them. This was an ill omen. And to me, it was totally the wonder and magic of the universe seeing this, and especially that it was so unexpected. It was just amazing. So I left, stayed high on that for a long, long time.
As somebody who has had all these different experiences with travel, seeing different parts of the world and experiencing these plant medicines, both those aspects to me seem like they'd be really transformative to consciousness and to the way you see and interact with the world. And you're somebody who, again, has had such longevity in your career, and you live such an interesting life. And almost 80 years old, you're continuing to share your message. How impactful is what I'm getting at here? Do you feel those two experiences specifically have been to expanding your mind and making you the interesting guy that you are?
I think they've been very formative, and also have shaped my philosophy of medicine and health. A lot of what I've written about, I really am aware of the magical nature of the universe and reality, and that is a source of great pleasure for me.
What does it feel like as somebody who was dipping their toe, not even dipping their toe? I'm not sure how far into the psychedelics you got, but somebody who's experimented, and at that time they were, or at least through part of that journey, because the way I see it, they were more accepted back in the day, and maybe you can talk more to this. And then, psychedelics were basically banned and nobody talked about them for a period of time. So I'd like for you to start talking about that, the evolution of psychedelics and the way that people basically shun them for a period of time. And secondarily, what I was originally getting at is, how does that feel as somebody who was into them when they were taboo, and now seeing them come around, and people in a general sense have this acceptance and this reverence for their potential?
Well, it's very gratifying. And I think when I first got into them, there was not yet the repression. There was a period of enthusiasm for them, and there was early research looking at their potential for helping terminal cancer patients become comfortable with with their approaching death, and not have as much pain, and not need as many opioids. There was very fascinating work done with prisoners. I mean, demonstrating the positive potential. Then it all got clamped down on, and there was this long period of repression. And one of the worst aspects of that was that research was blocked on them. So, nobody could get these substances to study them, or look for any of these positive effects. So the change that's happened now, all I can say is it's long in coming, overdue, and it's very gratifying to me to see this happen. And I really have this feeling that this could be the one thing out there that, might turn it all around.
Talk about what that catalyst for change was. They were, on lockdown. You mentioned the research. We couldn't even do research. What popped the lid off and then brought these back to the forefront? And at what year was this? Was this in the 90s or early
No,
2000s?
it's more recent than that. It's in the 2000s. I don't know. I don't know what year. I can't give a year for it. Maybe it's that there's some critical mass in society of people now who have had experience of these things. Maybe it's the baby boomers, had a lot of experience with this, now reaching an age where they're influential in society. Um, Possibly. I don't know all the reasons for it, but something has changed, and it's a very good thing.
Let's zoom back out and talk about mental health in a general sense. We're going to leave psychedelics, at least for now. And earlier, when you talked about caffeine, you brought up sleep quickly. And I'd like to talk about sleep and how that plays into our mental health.
Obviously, very, very important. And many people in our society are not getting good sleep. Either they're not getting enough or they're not getting good quality sleep. The use of sleep medications, both prescription and over the counter, is very widespread, and none of these things reproduce natural sleep. They all suppress dreaming, for example, and dreaming is a very critical aspect of healthy sleep. So I think uh, when I deal with someone who says that they're not sleeping well, there's a whole lot of questions I want to ask. There's a whole area called sleep hygiene that deals with everything from the comfort of your mattress to whether you have aches and pains to noise in the bedroom, light in the bedroom. I mean, all sorts of things like that, as well as use of caffeine, alcohol, and so forth. So you want to address all those things and try to figure out what the causes might be for why people are not sleeping well.
When it comes to sleep hygiene, there is so much talk in the health and wellness space about nighttime routines and different things we can do to accentuate our sleep. And again, we wouldn't be able to even cover them all here. They're countless. But what I'm curious is you, Dr. Weil, personally, what are some of the things you do to facilitate getting your deepest, most restful sleep?
Well, I use matcha green tea, but I use it in the morning. So by the time I'm ready to sleep, I don't have any effect from that. I try to reduce stimulation in the hour before I go to bed. I try to expose myself to dim light for the hour before I go to bed. I make sure that my bedroom is completely dark. And quiet. I think it's very important to sleep in complete darkness, and also to get some exposure to bright light during the day. That really helps regulate your melatonin cycle. So those are some things that I do. I use melatonin if I'm on the road. Sometimes I take valerian, the herb. Those are the two safest sleep supplements that I think are effective for most people.
Do you meditate before bed?
I do my breathing exercises. I do my 4-7-8 breath. I meditate in the morning.
And there's a lot of talk about gratitude when it comes to, nighttime routines and health and wellness from a well-being standpoint. Do you have a practice where you either mentally go through different aspects of your life that you're grateful for or write them down, or is that something you do?
I've had periods where I wrote them down, but now mostly I mentally review them. So when I'm falling asleep, I do my breathing exercise, relax my muscles, and then often I'll just review the day and maybe note 3 or 4 things that I have to be grateful for.
And what about journaling? Are you somebody that likes to just, write
No,
down your thoughts or just let your...
no, I'm not a good journaler. I do it mentally.
Let's tie in Alzheimer's and Parkinson's to this. This isn't a specific mental health challenge, but it involves the brain, so it's sort of connected. What are some things that people who are more predisposed to these conditions, what are things they can do early on to hopefully avoid having them? And then people that have started to experience symptoms from either of these disorders, what are things they can do as well to keep their brain as healthy as possible?
Well, this is in the category of neurodegenerative disease, which is one of the big categories of disease that kill and disable people prematurely. And with Parkinson's, I would bet any amount of money that this is environmentally caused. I think that this is exposure to toxins that damage very sensitive areas of the brain. So I think the advice I would give there is to really try to eliminate exposure to toxins in your life, whether that's pesticides, herbicides, agricultural chemicals, things you might have around the house. That's the best advice I can give. Also, be careful about the water you drink and, all of that. Alzheimer's is a little trickier. We really don't know all the factors involved there, but I wouldn't be surprised if there is an environmental influence as well. And also, we know that nutrition strongly influences brain health. So I think making sure that you're well supplied with antioxidants throughout your life, and the best way to do that is eating a variety of fruits and vegetables and natural beverages, green tea, all of that. Taking probably vitamin D, making sure your vitamin D levels are in the high optimum range. There are a few natural products. Probably one of the most interesting is lion's mane mushroom. This affects nerve health and cognitive function positively, non-toxic, can be taken over time long term. I think it's also very good to exercise the brain. One of the best ways to do that is to learn another language. You don't have to master it either. You just have to make the attempt to learn it. That's a very good thing to do.
So when it comes to brain health, mental health, we're going to umbrella and use those terms together now. Any other major aspects that we could get into to help facilitate living one's best life?
I think being curious, being around other people who are curious and mentally active, I think that's, very, very important.
All right, Dr. Weil, we're going to link everything up. We had a great conversation again. Always a pleasure to chat with you. We'll link up matcha.com and share your wonderful teas, and we'll link up your social media. And just want to thank you for your time again. This has been fun.
Yeah, we covered lots of stuff.
We always do. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed that conversation with Dr. Weil, be sure and stick around and watch my previous chat with him here. You're going to love it.
I think anything that helps contain inflammation, spices like ginger and turmeric, for example, are very good for brain health, because some of the problems that people develop, including Alzheimer's, really begin as inflammatory processes in the brain.